The diet that works the best for you is the one that you can sustain. So getting back to our theme of New Year's resolution diets, sure, anybody can do something for a month or 2 months or 3 months, but the problem with most of these diets is they're super restrictive in one way or another. You develop massive cravings. You've maybe lost a bunch of weight or maybe a bunch of water weight in a short amount of time, but you just can't keep going like this.
Welcome back to the Zoe Science Podcast, where we sit down with the world's leading experts on health, nutrition, and beyond to talk about the newest developments in science and how they can help you to live your healthiest life. I'm your host, Jonathan Wolf, CEO and co-founder of the personalized nutrition company, Zoe. You can find out more about Zoe at joinzoe.com/podcast and also get 10% off your personalized nutrition program. So the new year often means New Year's resolutions. So what does the science actually say? Today, we're going to discuss why a New Year's diet might actually be bad for your health, why calories might not matter, how losing weight fast can actually make you fat, and share some very practical advice on what eating healthily in 2022 looks like. On today's show, I'm joined by my friend, Professor Christopher Gardner, professor at Stanford University and one of the world's leading nutritional researchers. Christopher is also part of the Zoe family as a member of the Zoe Scientific Advisory Board and helping to run the Zoe Clinical Research Studies. Christopher, thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be here with you, Jonathan. Happy New Year.
Fantastic. So I'm so excited to have you here and sort of talk about all of those topics. But I think actually it'd be really fun just to start with sort of your own journey. How did you end up becoming this amazing nutritional researcher? What brought you here?
Well, actually, it's a whole string of mistakes because in undergrad, I was actually a philosophy major in upstate New York at Colgate University. And afterwards, I really thought I probably never should have been in college. I should have been a bohemian. And so I kind of roamed the country working at restaurants and trying to figure out where my inner child was or inner peace or purpose. And along the way, I met a girl and we hung out together a lot. And then I moved to California to be with her and she dumped me. She was a vegetarian. I wasn't at the time. I became a vegetarian to get her back. She didn't take me back. But
and was it the not being a vegetarian that ended it, or was it more to it than this?
Yeah, it was a few other things than that. So anyway, that whole switch didn't work, but I actually liked being a vegetarian. So then I was working in vegetarian restaurants. I biked across Europe and brought nutrition books with me. And I came back from a big bike trip in Europe and said, okay, I'm old enough. I need a job. I guess I'll pick something. Why don't I pick a vegetarian restaurant? I'll make one of those because I really like food. But oh my gosh, people are going to make fun of my amino acids and I really want an articulate response. Maybe I should actually get a master's degree. So I showed up at Berkeley with long hair and Birkenstocks and I said, can I please get a master's degree? And they laughed at me. And they said, you only took Psych 101 in college. You have no science background whatsoever. And I said, I know, that's how I got out of my gen ed requirement for science. I was a philosophy major. They said, you need to take regular chem, biochem, organic chem, biology. And I said, yeah, I'm not afraid. I'll go back and take those. And so I actually took 2 years of makeup classes, straight science for 2 years. And I came back and I actually got all A's and A pluses. And they said, you're actually not as stupid as we thought when we looked at your transcript as a philosophy major. Hey, why don't you get a PhD? And I said, what the hell do I need a PhD to open a restaurant for? Oh, wait. Oh, I remember being in school when you're full of potential and people say, what are you going to be when you grow up? And say, I don't know, I could be anything. I'm in school. I want that feeling back. So I signed up for the PhD. I never opened the restaurant. I got the PhD in nutrition science at Berkeley. And I actually didn't do a very good dissertation project. I thought the science was a little weak. But I was a really good teaching assistant. I thought, maybe this is my destiny. I should be a teacher. And I applied for lots of things and never even got an interview. And I actually got married at the time and had a kid and I needed money. And I looked all over for a job. I was desperate for a job with a PhD from Berkeley. And the last thing I found was a seminar at Stanford in a group that does behavioral interventions. And somebody there said, we do have a postdoctoral research fellowship. You want to apply for that? I said, sure, I don't really have another job. I got the fellowship and I got in and I said, God, I hope there's not a lot of research because I'm not very good at research. I'm a better teacher. And they said, no, actually the postdoc is all research. There's no teaching. thought, oh my God, I'm screwed, but I needed the job for my family, but okay, I'll try to push through. Turned out this group that focused on behavioral interventions was much more interesting than actually the group where I got my PhD at Berkeley, where it was nutrition science, but a lot of it was animal models, cell models, mechanism. And my dissertation had actually been on acculturating Hispanics in the Mission District of San Francisco and how acculturation in their diets affected their cardiovascular risk factors. And this group at Stanford is actually where I still am today, the Stanford Prevention Research Center, founded 50 years ago by a guy named Jack Farquhar, who was really interested in community-based interventions and behavior, with a whole group of behavioral psychologists, and then some specialists in nutrition or smoking, tobacco control, or exercise. And so the behavioral psychologists were all about, hey, everybody kind of knows to eat better, exercise more, and not smoke, but so many people have challenges doing that. Let's see how we can do this. And this group was incredibly supportive. And so all of a sudden I started doing better science because I was getting some great mentorship. And so now I've been there for almost 30 years, love this faculty group that I'm with, have intervened on more than 2,000 people, have done more than 20 nutritional randomized trials, a lot of it with the NIH funding. And then I met Jonathan and Tim Spector, and they came to my office one day and said, hey, we have this moonshot in mind. Want to play? And I kind of wanted to play. So that's how we know each other.
That's a brilliant story. And I feel like the world might be a little poorer without that vegetarian restaurant. So, it's not too late, Christopher. I'm looking forward to, post the pandemic, traveling again. I'd like to experience that. But it's a beautiful story about how sometimes just following our passions can get you towards something that also you end up being great at, right? Because somehow the things that you enjoy are the things you're willing to put the time into, right? And then you tend to get those rewards. So that's a brilliant sort of set of context. And also I think what's interesting, as you rightly said, is, a lot of nutritional science research historically has been very small scale, very mechanistic, and therefore focused on sort of individual components. And I think part of sort of this new wave, and we're going to talk about this today, right, is understanding that you really need to step back, understand what happens in human beings at large scales, to really understand what's going on in all this complexity of food.
Absolutely. Yep. Had many pivots along the way trying to figure that out. One I didn't actually mention was, as I got started being interested in plant-based diets, I was interested in garlic and soy and antioxidants. And I was getting some studies funded to look at those things. And I distinctly remember giving a 1-hour lecture on garlic and allicin and the putative active agent and mechanism and all kinds of things. And when I was done, I said, okay, so who has questions? And the first person raised their hand said, is Atkins or Zone better for weight loss? And the next person raised their hand and they said, so is a calorie really a calorie? And I just talked for an hour on garlic. What? And so that actually was another pivot in my life where I said, God, as interested as I am in this, the general population is really interested in weight management and some of the fad diets that are out there. And so we'll probably get into this, but I wrote a study design comparing Atkins and Zone that got published back in 2007 in JAMA, the A to Z study that kind of launched my career again, unexpectedly. It's just because people didn't want to listen to my garlic talk. They wanted to know this other thing. And I looked and I said, there aren't very good data there. I could probably write a study.
No, that's brilliant. Well, let's talk about that right now. It's the new year. So everyone is thinking about a diet right now, right? To improve their health and to lose weight. And we're sort of trained, you eat way too much in December. And then in January, suddenly you're like, oh, I've got to go and make this like big, profound change. However, there's actually some really amazing data and a lot of scientific data showing that most diets actually end up being bad for us. And, and this was a huge surprise to me as I got into this over the last few years, that in general, if you go and start these diets, you actually end up being heavier than when you started. Can you tell us a bit more about, I guess, what we really know about what happens if you choose to go into sort of these traditional, calorie controlled diets, and why actually, they can end up being a bad thing rather than a good thing for us?
Yeah, but we'll have to unpack that a little bit because there's a couple of questions involved. Absolutely. There. So calories to the side. first let's talk about all the fad diets and all the media and magazines that on the front cover say, hey, lose this much weight this fast. The very nature of being a fad diet means it's really hard for me as a scientist to study that and provide people with any data, because the very nature of a fad diet is that it will go out of fashion and people won't follow it anymore. That means if I'm thinking, wow, there's a really interesting fad diet that everybody's on, I'm going to write a big grant and try to study it for 5 or 10 years. And then the reviewer looks at it and says, why would I fund this? It's a fad diet. It'll be out of fashion later. So for a lot of these things that were coming up, there really wasn't good evidence. We had decades of people promoting a low fat diet. And sadly, there was really a lot of good evidence for portions of this low fat diet that got dumbed down and oversimplified to just low fat. It really was a lot more about more vegetables, more beans, more nutritious plant-based foods, less of the snack foods. And oh my God, it went on and on and on until your eyes glazed over and people said, well, I could make this simpler for the population. I guess it sounds like a lower fat diet. Isn't it lower saturated fat? Yeah, but they won't know that. Let's just say low fat and the saturated fat will go down too. And so the food industry said, yeah, we could do that. We can pump lots of sugar into food, and we can take the fat out of the cookies and put the sugar in them and do some other things. And so low fat wasn't really working because that was so much of an oversimplification that wouldn't have worked to begin with. And when it didn't work, people said, oh my God, the health professionals are all wrong. And it's low carb. That's what we should do, is low carb. And it actually was never low carb either. It was low refined grain and low added sugar, but getting into all those specificities made it harder to follow. So it actually got dumbed down again to low carb, to which people were saying, there's not a lot of evidence for this in 2000. So a bunch of studies got done. We did one of them, 20 other people did them. And after 5, 10, 15, 20 years, if you look at the bulk of evidence, and there's a lot of it, there's almost no difference between low carb and low fat on average when people try these diets. And Jonathan, one of the challenges is low fat and low carb is too generic. People follow them in many different ways. And so when we did what we call the A to Z study, A was for Atkins, Z was for Zone, O was for Ornish, and T was for a traditional health professionals approach. We had 311 women follow these diets for a year. The way we got them to follow it needs to be explained, because instead of housing them and incarcerating them and feeding them by spoonful after spoonful, we just had them read the popular books. We thought this is a very generalizable way to answer the question. We actually practically had a dietitian read the books aloud to them to make sure that they at least read them, because we knew some people were following the diets without having read it. They just, my uncle and my aunt did this, and so no, they weren't actually doing it right. So they read the whole book. At the end of a year, the average weight loss was almost identical in all 4 groups. But what really struck me was that in all 4 groups, so there's like 75 in a group, some of the women had lost 25, 35, 45 pounds, and some had gained 5 or 10. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. They got the same advice and they had this huge range of difference. And the average difference was a few pounds, but the range was identical. Somebody succeeded fantastically on all 4 diets, and someone failed miserably, and they weren't outliers. It was everything in between. And so I started looking in the literature, looking for more mechanistic explanations. And I came across this idea of insulin resistance that's very popular in the health community right now. And also a colleague came along and said, I have a genetic explanation that might show that some people are genetically predisposed. And so we took the results from that study, Jonathan, and we proposed just doing a low carb and a low fat diet, just to head to head with 600 people, this time men and women.
So you were sort of looking for 2 things, right? One was this question, is low carb or low fat better, which is a topic that we hear people talking about all the time, right? There's been a huge amount in particular about this idea that low carb is good. But then you're also trying to understand sort of these personalized responses and say, can I actually predict that somebody is going to respond well to the low fat or the low carb diet because of the things you were talking about, your sort of insulin response or your genetics. Is that right?
Pretty much, except I really was not trying to see if low carb or low fat was better. I looked at all the literature and said, it's not going to make any difference. On average, it's just not. I've seen 20 studies, including mine, which I'm very proud of, where there was virtually no difference. But there's this massive variability. What is going on? Couldn't we help people who say, yes, the two diets on average are pretty good for people if you do them in a healthy way, but could you find out how to personalize that diet, to tailor it to your metabolism or your genetics? And so this really took up 10 years of my life, between getting my grant rejected 4 or 5 times, to running a 5-year study, to writing the paper and waiting a year for it to be published. And, I almost jumped up and down when I saw that, yes, the weight loss was virtually identical in the 2 groups, 300 each, in men and women. Fantastic. And yes, the variability is enormous. There's like a 60 to 80 pound range of response in the same individuals getting the same advice from the same enthusiastic and knowledgeable dietitians. Okay, now we'll go in with our insulin resistance test, and oh crap, I didn't explain it. Okay, how about that genetic predisposition? Crap, that didn't do it either. Oh my God. These were 2 things that seemed quite plausible. And I thought, it's cool. We're going to have this great study. We're going to have this simple way to point people in one direction or another. And it didn't really work. And so, since we published that in 2018, we've been looking back at all the different things that are going on. And that's why I'm super excited to work with Zoe and the microbiome and personalizing diets, because the variability was still there. I got the variability that we totally expected, where some people failed and thrived on the same diet and some are in the middle. So there's a lot of room there for personalization. It just didn't happen to be as simple as insulin resistance or genetic predisposition. So that's how come I'm super happy to hang out with you guys right now.
And I think it's a brilliant story. Can we unpack that a little bit step by step? Because again, I think for a lot of people listening, they're not coming in with 30 years of previous experience expecting to get the same results. And I think there's quite a few things in here. The Diet Fit study is one of my absolute favorite research studies of all time in nutrition. And I think although you might have taken for granted some of the results, I think to do that at that scale with this quality and control is really interesting. So I think there's a number of things in this. So the first thing that's interesting actually is that on average, people lost weight across both of these, right? So this idea that low fat is better than low carb or the other way around isn't true. But actually in both of these cases, people on average lost quite a lot of weight. And what's interesting is this was not about calorie restriction, was it? So I think that, coming back to this, think of people, in the new year saying, well, I'm going to eat 1,400 calories a day for the next month, and then I'm going to lose weight, and that's going to set me up for life. Could you tell us a bit about what the guidance was in both cases? Because I think it's quite radical to think about sort of losing weight, getting healthier, which we see is very lean, without something which is really fundamentally saying, well, I'm like a car, and it's just the number of calories that come in and the calories that come out, and that's the only thing that really matters. Could you sort of unpick that a bit? Because I think for me, this is the most striking gap between what sort of cutting edge scientists understand about nutrition and what I think most people, including a lot of government advice, what we're being told.
Absolutely. And this gets into this whole, is a calorie thing. And so let me address that really quickly up front. I actually firmly believe that you have to drop calories to lose weight. At one level, a calorie is a calorie. If everybody added 1,000 calories a day to their diet, everyone would gain weight. If everyone dropped 1,000 calories a day from their diet, everyone would lose weight. They wouldn't gain the same amount of weight, and they wouldn't lose the same amount of weight if everybody did 1,000 calories, but they would all gain weight if they increased, and they would all lose weight if they decreased. So the fascinating part is what is explaining that differential. And so, in the middle of our study, there was a major publication by the American College of Cardiology, the Obesity Society, and the American Heart Association. And they went through all the diets, fad diets and not, whatever there was evidence for. And they said, okay, so we have looked through them all, and we have a stunning conclusion that to lose weight, you have to reduce your caloric intake. And there's more evidence for this and there's less for that. And they got into all the details. And there was one tiny little paragraph that I really enjoyed. They said, and sometimes this was achieved with a prescribed energy restriction, and sometimes it was achieved with an achieved but not prescribed energy restriction. And I thought, oh my God, wait a sec. How did we design our study? We never told people an amount of calories to cut back. We very specifically said low carbers and low fatters. We want you in the first 8 weeks to try to get to 20 grams of carb or 20 grams of fat per day, which is really much lower than anybody's accustomed to eating. And we're going to call this the limbo phase. And part of this is actually just psychological. We want to anchor you psychologically to think, oh my God, to be in this study, I'm going to have to make some real changes. There's going to be some stuff that I can't eat anymore. And there's going to be some stuff I should eat more of. Okay, I'm in a real study. It's a Stanford run, NIH funded study. I better do a good job on this thing. And we said, to be honest, we think to get down to that low a level of carb or fat, you're going to be restricting some foods that have some good nutrients. And we're not actually sure that's healthy long term. So after you've hit that sometime in the first 8 weeks, we would like you to add some fat and carb back to a level where you feel like it's the lowest you could be, that you could sustain forever, that you could look us in the eye and say, hey, Professor Gardner, if this works for me, man, this works for me socially. I like the taste. I like the food choices. I could eat this forever, because one of the themes that's going around now, Jonathan, is the diet that works the best for you is the one that you can sustain. So getting back to our theme of New Year's resolution diets, sure, anybody can do something for a month or 2 months or 3 months. But the problem with most of these diets is they're super restrictive in one way or another. You develop massive cravings. You've maybe lost a bunch of weight or maybe a bunch of water weight in a short amount of time, but you just can't keep going like this. It does not work for you.
And then you get all this rebound, right? So not only have you lowered your metabolism, so actually you're burning fewer calories. This is one of the things that a lot of, the studies that people have discussed with me show. But then, of course, you come out of it and you have all these cravings. You don't sustain it. You're now eating, badly because you've just deprived yourself. Your body is screaming out that you've gone through famine or something, right? And so what was different in your study? What were people doing if they weren't, if they weren't restricting calories on either side, how was it possible that they could have lost weight?
So really what it was is because they were supposed to still eat low carb or low fat, there were a lot of foods that they should not consume and that they stopped consuming, or at least in those amounts. And we were very specific about added sugar and refined grain for both diets, and eating lots of vegetables on both diets. Those are 3 concepts that people were doing the same, whether it was low carb or low fat. And we did say, look us in the eye. Not only do you like this, but you're not hungry. So you can't tell us that this is working really well for you if you're hungry and uncomfortable, because then it won't last. And so one of the things that I've hit on personally, Jonathan, and I haven't done this study, but I would love it to be the follow-up, is sort of the satiety study. So I actually think that, and I've actually posed this question in the nutrition classes I teach at Stanford. I propose a breakfast of cheesy eggs, and make it a healthy thing. Make it a veggie omelet with salsa on it, but put eggs and cheese and fat in it. And on the other side, here's some steel cut oats with berries in it, and low fat milk in it. And so I've got kind of a high fat cheesy egg breakfast, and I've got a low fat steel cut oatmeal breakfast. And I say, who thinks that they would be hungry an hour later? And when I asked this in class the other day, it was actually a 50% split. 50% say they'd be hungrier on the oatmeal and 50% on the eggs. And, I'm thinking about people trying to eat these cheesy eggs, and I can just imagine this. So be this person. Somebody's doing it, say, oh, wow, this is super filling. I'm not even sure I can eat this. And somebody else saying, awesome. Can I have a whole nother serving of cheesy eggs? That was great. And then, 2 people have eaten twice as many, one twice as many as the other, from a satiety perspective. And somebody's eaten the oatmeal, said, wow, I had this big bowl of oatmeal. That was fantastic. Oh my God, an hour later, I'm hungry. I guess I'm going to have to eat again. And another group saying, oh my God, I'm bloated. I'm not sure if I'm going to eat lunch. And so my real interest right now is this idea of personal satiety, where you're choosing healthy foods, whether they're low carb or low fat, sensible foods, whole foods, not gimmicky foods, but that there is that room for personalization. Because when you looked at the folks in our study, they reported cutting back on calories, but we never gave them a prescribed calorie restriction. We just said, eat healthy, eat whole foods, eat low carb or low fat. And collectively, they lost more than 6,000 pounds. And so this is fascinating for me that we weren't giving them the prescribed calorie restriction. And for those of your listeners who are remembering trying this before, if somebody really does say, okay, so, and this is a bit of a myth that we may or may not get into, a pound of fat is about 3,500 calories. If you divide that by 7 days a week, that's 500 calories a day that you'd have to be in deficit. You eat 2,500 calories a day-ish. So you're going to have to eat 20% less every day from now on. And the first thing that goes through your mind is, crap, I'm going to be hungry forever. This is so demoralizing. Like 20% less all day long, every day, as opposed to, oh no, we don't have a caloric level for you. No, we want you to eat until you're satiated. We want you to have a diet that you can sustain long-term. And what you end up...
So that means switching the sorts of food you eat, right? And thinking about the quality of food, which rather than thinking about all food as just being like a number of calories and saying, well, I've just got this quota for my day. Yeah.
And then the fun part for me is, from all the studies that we've seen, there isn't any one diet that does that. There are lots of options for those diets. And what I'm really excited that Zoe's trying to get at here is, how can we collect the data and how can we provide the advice that will lead?
What you want to know is, for you as an individual, that sort of came out of the Diet Fits, right?
Yeah. Yep. And so this is, I love how much Zoe focuses on the microbiome, because this is such a hot new topic of understanding the connections between the bacteria and our gut, what we're feeding them. That means both the low carb and the low fat diets should have enough fiber to be feeding the microbiota. It could mean fermented foods. We've just done a fermented food versus fiber food study that got published in Cell about differences in inflammation that respond to fermented and high fiber diets. So a lot of exciting stuff still to do.
So talk a bit more about like what, in 2022, even if I don't know which of these sides I'm going to be, I think your view is there's quite a lot of common ground of things that we know are good for everybody. And if you're thinking about that diet today, rather than jumping off to this sort of crazy calorie controlled thing that you'll drop out of, here are actually things that you practically could be putting into your diet, adding to your diet that are going to be good.
Yeah. And Jonathan, I give a lot of talks, and I've been having success with a set of slides that I can't show on your podcast, but it starts out saying,
we'll find a way to link to them in the titles.
It does seem that there's a lot of controversy and people bickering over this, but in fact, I could take the two most polar opposites I can think of, ketogenic and low-fat vegan. It seems like those are Republicans and Democrats in the US. They will never agree on anything. And yet, both of them would say too much added sugar and refined grain, not enough vegetables, not enough whole foods, too many processed foods. If you take just that, just to point out the magnitude of that problem, there was a really nice publication in 2019 or 2020 by Shan et al. And JAMA. And they have a beautiful graphic showing a trend from about the year 2000 to current day. And they're looking at proteins, carbs, and fats. And it's kind of funny because it's such a big study. They get statistical significance across these 2 decades, showing there's a little more protein and a little less carb, but it hardly budges at all over the course of these 20 years. And that's the first graph, is just protein, carb, fat. The second set of graphs is type of protein, type of carb, type of fat. And this one is compelling. So if you start with type of fat, it's about, I'm oversimplifying, but 10% mono, 10% poly, and 10% saturated fat. That's 30% from fat. From protein, it's about 10% animal protein and 5% plant protein. So that's 15% of your diet. The rest is carb. So it's like 55% carb, of which 10% is high quality carb and 40% is low quality carbohydrate. And so if you look across this set of three graphics, you see the three types of fat, different types of protein, and high quality carbs are all about 10% each. And the elephant in the room is the 40% low quality carbs. That's the added sugars and the refined grains and the pastries and the junk foods and the food cues and the advertisements. And you can have this anytime. Now you can have a cookie and a coffee, a mocha frappuccino in the library, when before you couldn't eat in the library, but now they actually have a coffee house in the library. So think about eliminating 40% of your calories from added sugars and refined grain and low quality carbs. And then think, okay, you have to add it back. I mean, you lose a ton of weight if you could cut back 40% of your calories and not be hungry and not replace it all. But that's really not going to work. So let's replace a lot of it. So is there only one way after you've cut back on that to replace it? Or could some people have more fat and some people have more carb? I will add an interesting twist that I don't know if you want to get into or not. Most people eat about the same amount of protein all the time. If you look at all of our studies, whether it's Atkins zone, Ornish, ketogenic, Mediterranean, I've got a ton of studies. It is striking how consistent the protein is, around 18 to 20% of calories. It hardly varies.
It's interesting.
So that might be a place you don't want to go right now. So really, most of it is a difference in carb and fat.
What are foods that in 2022 I should feel really, I should feel good about eating? You're telling me as long as I eat till I'm full and these are healthy foods, actually that's setting me up for life. And you were saying there are all these things that even, sort of vegans and keto people are agreeing on. What are the positive things that actually, we can be aligned on? And, I'm in the new year. I ate a little bit too much over the holidays. I want to set myself up on the right way permanently. What should I be adding into my diet?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the set of the imaginary slides that I'm not showing right now, and sort of outside that initial circle of more veggies, less refined grain and added sugars, I have beans. Oh my God. So many kinds of beans that people could eat. And there's hummus, from a Mediterranean culture, and there's a 3-bean salad, and there's bean soups, and there's so many great lentil dishes. So, oh my God, they have lectins. Please avoid beans because of the lectins. Okay, that's total BS. The lectins
and help us to understand, like why are beans good, but my flour in my bread, which also comes from a plant, right? Why is that? Why is that in your bad carbs in the pastry? What's the difference between those two?
So there's gobs of data to show that, especially try reading Blue Zones, for example. So the Blue Zones book, one of the most consistent themes across all those different 6 places around the world where more than a usual number of people live to be more than 100, I think beans is the most consistent theme across. It's a whole food. It's got lots of fiber. They usually don't have much fat. Actually, soybeans have quite a bit of fat, and soy is actually a great source of protein and nutrition. So there's so much variety and so much taste, and there's just a lot of great nutrients and fiber and vitamins and minerals. I don't know how you can possibly go wrong with beans, especially.
And so it's this complexity, right, that you get from any of these whole foods, which really differentiates from the sort of the ultra processed things that you're talking about being such a big part of our diet, right? That so much is being taken out. Whereas these things which are much closer to a whole food, like just, we talk a lot about this with people on the microbiome side, right? About all those different things that are sort of feeding our gut. And you see this across your studies?
Yes. And part of it is the food matrix, so one of the issues that, we're always looking for is a slow release of glucose from the carbs that you ate. And that happens with beans. But since you mentioned grains, this is actually a great place to go. Let's talk about grains, refined grains, whole grains, and intact whole grains. So this might be a little.
I'm always looking for more things I'm allowed to eat. So keep going.
Yeah. So a fairly simple concept is this idea of the glycemic index, which is the rate at which the carbs and the glucose from the foods that you're eating shows up in your blood. And if it shows up quickly, you get an insulin spike and you put the glucose away too fast. And you don't want spikes of high insulin and high glucose and then low. You'd like to level that playing field. I know Zoe does a great job with that, with continuous glucose monitors and things like that. So picture this, you've got white bread and you've been a white bread eater forever. and somebody says, you should go try a more European rye or pumpernickel or whole, oh my God, so many great bakeries where they have whole grain breads. Well, technically, maybe this is more in America than in the UK, but certainly the whole wheat breads are pretty similar to the white breads. They're really not all, many of them are not all that whole. And think about, so for a white flour bread, you can tell there's not much fiber in it. For a whole wheat bread, all the nutrients are there and actually all the fibers there. But think how much processing was done to make that into a flour. So let's put some whole grain flour in your hand and just blow it out of your hand. How much digestion is left to do there? So so
just what you're saying, just to be clear, right? It has already been pulverized into tiny, tiny pieces. That's what you're saying, right, Christopher?
Yeah, you don't barely have to chew it. You can almost swallow. You can't drink it, but so now think where that came from. It actually came from a wheat berry. Now, Jonathan, I make a kick-ass wheat berry salad. And so I boil up and soak some wheat berries for an hour or so. And then I add some savory things, sweet things, crunchy things, all vegetable. I've got some spring onions, some bell peppers, some pecans in there, some apples, some celery. I've got some lemon zest. I've got some pomegranate molasses on top. That is added sugar, actually, pomegranate molasses, but not too much. I've got some olive oil in it.
It sounds amazing. I'm looking forward to having it at your vegetarian restaurant next year.
I bring it to student events and like, oh my God, can I have this recipe? I can't tell you how many times I've been asked for my wheat berry salad recipe. And it's a whole intact wheat berry. Sometimes people say, oh, a wheat what? A wheat berry? I don't know. Wheat had berries in it. No. That's just the name of the whole grain. Or instant oats versus steel cut oats, or whole barley in a soup. And so one of the things that I've seen in my field lately is people not only saying whole grain, but whole intact grain, because that's the kind that you're going to have to chew up. It's going to take some work. It's going to hit your digestive tract. There's a food matrix around it. The carbs, the glucose won't get released as quickly. And there's a lot of ways to eat those. So if you go with whole intact grains in a number of different ways, and if you go with beans, if you go with fruits, let's talk about listening to Rob Lustig talk about how much he hates fructose. Fructose is poison. Fructose is toxic. What about the fructose in fruits? Oh, fine. He'll just stop right there and say, oh, food matrix comes with fiber. It's bound up with cells. I'm really not talking about the fructose in fruits. Sure, fruits have antioxidants. They provide vitamins and minerals. So whole fruits are okay. And then we get into so orange juice. No. Orange juice, especially where they took out all the pulp, that's just like drinking a soda.
I've tried drinking orange juice while wearing a glucose monitor, and it was actually worse than the test I did with Coca-Cola. So it was really that sort of mind-blowing, right? So I think this idea, which I think again was completely novel to me a few years ago, that food has a food matrix, which sounds very cool, right? Like the Matrix, but actually that this is sort of really essential. And once you smash it up enough, that's sort of what you're saying, right? You gave this example with the wheat, and I guess it's the same thing with the oranges, right? If you've crushed it completely and all you're left with is the juice and the sugar, that's a completely different place. But I think for a lot of people, your positivity about fruit will seem a bit surprising, because after all, fruit is stuffed full of sugar. I have a little girl, and she's getting worse and worse about what she's willing to eat, but she's still happy to eat fruit. It's really sweet. So I think that's going to be a surprise for people. Why? Surely the sugar is terrible. It's what we're hearing all the time, like sugar in food is really bad. How can fruit still be okay? Okay.
And then, so two of my favorite phrases, Jonathan, are instead of what and it depends. Okay. So let's say I'm going to have steel cut oats, and I'm going to not make it low fat. I'm going to make it more fat because I'm going to put crumbled up walnuts on it, which I pretty much do. That's one of my stable breakfasts. And then tell me I can put raspberries and blackberries or cut up peaches or things on it like that. Okay. So I was going to have the oatmeal, and then I thought, wow, there's this other thing I'd really rather have. So I'm having the oatmeal instead of this. I guess I'm going to have the cheesy eggs or the cheesy eggs and bacon and sausage or something like that. You say, no, you can have oatmeal and nuts and berries on it and fruits. Wow, this is okay. I think I could have that instead of the cheesy eggs and the bacon and sausage. Now it's sounding really good. And so now it's part of this. It depends. Also, I'm having the fruit with this steel cut oats. I'm having the fruits instead of this candy bar. I'm having the fruit with this. I'm having it as part of this. So I have a father-in-law who's a great cook, and his salads, his lettuce-based salads, almost always have fruits on the salad. He's got nuts and figs and things like that. And he often puts berries or cut up pieces of fruit in there. And the lettuce-based salad is actually much nicer that way. So if it's not just fruit, it's that way. Or it's the idea of there's an apple in my pocket that I'm going to have for a snack, or a candy bar. They're both pretty convenient. Oh my God, I was going to put some vegetables in my pocket, but I'm having a hard time picturing having the vegetable in my pocket as a snack. But the peach or the apple or the little tin of raspberries or blackberries or something, that's actually pretty convenient. So instead of the candy bar or the power bar or the protein bar that I was going to have, which is one of these ultra processed foods, as you were referring to before. So I do think there's room for fruits. So now we've got some beans, some whole intact grains, some fruits. Okay. And now I'm going to move to nuts, which, oh my God, for the low fat vegan folks is going to drive them nuts. But that nuts are great. Yeah. Nuts and seeds. Oh my God. They add fat. They add flavor. They're a fairly good source of protein. I put nuts in so many things. My wife actually, I have jars of cashews and pecans and walnuts and pecans, and I'll make something and she'll say, oh no, here he goes again. He's going to put nuts on it. So I so often sprinkle a handful of an ounce or so of nuts on something, and it really enhances the taste for me, really more likely that I'm going to eat that thing. What I made last night.
And this blows, I think, a lot of people's minds, including people, who study nutritional science very recently, right? We have a lot of people who come straight out of nutritional science degrees and come and work at Zoe. And one of the things that they're sort of most shocked by is how positive we are about nuts for the vast majority of people who do our tests, because obviously they're incredibly calorically dense, right? So there's loads and loads and loads of calories in a nut, and it's got fats in it, and it's got saturated fat. It's like, well, that's really bad. You mustn't have it. But actually, I think what you're saying is sort of the same thing that we've seen through these studies, that actually, again, the amount of calories in a food is really doesn't really matter. It's about the quality and the impact that it has on your body.
Yeah. So those nuts, ounce per ounce actually have a lot of calories. You might have 170 calories or something in an ounce of nuts, but you're more likely to eat this other thing that you had the nuts with. I was going to say last night what I made is a soup. The base is really sweet potatoes and yams, or actually whichever ones are orange. I always get the sweet potatoes and the yams confused. But anyway, the orange ones, which are starchy. So there's a lot of people opposed to starchy vegetables. But I've got these cut up yams, and I've got them in with peas and red bell peppers. I put some broccoli stems that I cut up in there. I got garbanzo beans. I got tomatoes in the soup. And then, beautiful sort of medley of Moroccan type spices. I've got turmeric in there, some cinnamon, some cumin, beautiful. Oh, and it's yellow because the turmeric, it's this beautiful golden thing. And then my wife doesn't like it, so I don't put it in the mix. I add nuts on top of that when I'm all done. She said, oh my God, kitchen sink. You got everything in the damn soup. And I said, it smells so good, and it's so more. And the nuts, I think I come back more often because I got a sprinkling of nuts on top. So
you're making me so hungry, Christopher. I want that one also on the menu when I come to the vegetarian restaurant. This is
okay. So I'm having that. And so, now we've got whole intact grains and beans and fruits and nuts. These are all whole foods. Those are all high carb. Every one of them is high carb. But all the plant foods are mostly carbs. They really don't have that much protein. Don't get me on the protein rant. It's really easy to meet your protein needs. Be really hard not to meet your protein needs with a varied diet. But you could swing that one way or another for low fat or low carb, depending on how many nuts or Did you put olive oil on your salad, or did you just use balsamic vinegar and lemon? Something like that. So in our studies, that's how we were doing it. Everybody was having a salad every day, or was asked to on Diet Fits. Some are say, oh, be very generous with the avocado and the olive oil. And others were, oh, no, you need to leave the avocado off for now and the nuts, but you can have lemon and balsamic vinegar. And we're going to have sweet red bell peppers for you, and crunchy carrots and crunchy celery. And we're going to add radishes and a bunch of things to this and make it beautiful looking, beautiful tasting. But yours is going to be a low fat salad. Yours is going to be a high fat salad, right? But these are all whole foods.
The question I have, just to follow up on something you picked up earlier, is how this interacts with the microbiome. And you mentioned that a little bit earlier, talking about the bacteria in our gut and this new study that you just published recently. In your view, and this is obviously the science here is all sort of very new. How does the microbiome? Does it matter very much? I guess is the first question from your perspective. And how does that tie into this description of focusing much more on foods than I think what we used to talk about, right? Which was sort of particular chemicals that might be in a food,
right,
or whether it's a unsaturated fat or a saturated fat or things like that. How does it play in, and what did you learn out of this study? Maybe you could just describe it briefly to us.
Okay, and first I have to give tons of credit to Justin and Erica Sonnenberg, who are really world famous microbiologists at Stanford, who for the last decade or so have done all their work in mice. They've done their work not only in mice, but in gnotobiotic mice, which are born germ-free. They've got no bacteria in their colon. They have to keep them in a hood and keep them protected from the outside world. And then they can introduce 1 or 2 bacterial strains to their gut, and they can study everything in detail. And they were doing all this work with mice and finding how much of their microbiome and subsequent health matters were affiliated with what they were feeding them. It all seemed to boil down to diet. And they would give them a single fiber from inulin, which is from chicory root, which is a fiber that's added lots of times. Or they would give them mixed fibers from what would be more of a mixed diet. And it wasn't just the amount of fiber, it was the types of fiber. It was diverse fibers that were helping the bacteria in these mouse studies grow. And they were thinking, God, if this is really all about food, why are we working with mice so often? The things we study in mice don't work with humans. Are we really going to do this for 3 or 4 decades and never get to humans? And the two of us met at a conference one day, and it was like the 2 pieces of an amulet magically came together, because I think poop is icky, and that's where we're getting our microbiome stuff. And the Sonnenbergs were terrified of humans, thinking, God, humans are a pain in the ass. They cancel, they don't show up, they reschedule, and our group thrives.
And of course, with human beings also, it's much harder to really know that they're following a particular diet, right? Because they get to choose every day, in fact, what they eat. I'm pleased to say we don't do the sort of studies people did 100 years ago, on inmates, which is where a lot of early powerful studies. So human beings are very difficult because actually they have a lot of control. And coming back to what you were saying, right? The challenge is sticking to a diet. If you want somebody to do something that's difficult, they tend to fall off. So I mean, I have some sympathy, right? This is but of course, at the end of the day, we care about how humans respond to food rather more than how mice respond to food.
Yep. So anyway, they were willing to take a risk with me, and I was super excited to have yet another reason to have people thinking about their food. And I have to point out, Jonathan, if you actually go back a number of years when we first met, the Sonnenberg said, hey, you have that big Diet Fits weight loss study going on. Why don't you ask them if we can measure their microbiome? And I said, oh my God, the human subjects folks, do you know how many things we do to them? We poke them, we prod them, we bleed them. Now you want me to ask them for their poop? And what exactly can you tell them? Well, we're not sure yet. We're experimenting. And I said, yeah, it's going to work really well. Okay, I agree to make it optional. Okay, so how many of you folks are willing to go home, collect your poop, put it in your freezer, tell your family not to eat the poop in the freezer, send it to us, and we're not sure what we'll tell you. Jonathan, 80% of the people in our study volunteered to do this extra step. They were fascinated.
And I'm not surprised at all. I mean, when we first started Zoe and we were looking for investors to fund this, one of the biggest things people were saying was, well, nobody's ever going to give you their poop, that's like a really big barrier. And we said, well, actually, we think it's going to be all right. And actually, what it turned out is, and the good news is, we don't ask anyone to put their poop in the fridge. Just to clarify that,
yes.
is what we all do this quite a few times every week. It's a very easy thing to do, and if you're getting this amazing information back, right, which you never knew anything about, our experience is that people are very happy to do it. And when they've done it once, they realize, it's pretty trivial. But I can understand that before you do it, you're like, oh, that's a huge barrier. So, but 80% tells you that people were very interested in this new thing. And so what did you find out?
So, well, I just want to say we've now done 6 studies with Sonnenbergs. We signed people up left and right to do this. You're right. The methods are much easier. And the most recent study we did was we asked 36 people, 18 in each group, to eat a lot of fiber or a lot of fermented food, one being prebiotics, the fiber, and one being probiotics, the fermented food, where you're actually eating live bacteria. And to get into the study, you couldn't be a high fiber eater, which is pretty easy in the US. Not many people are high fiber eaters, but we did exclude a few.
To be honest, true across the developed world everywhere.
Pretty sad.
It's particularly bad in the States, but it's not much better across Europe. But you definitely see, Southern European countries better than Northern European, and that also tying back to, generally better health outcomes as you go into Southern Europe versus the States or Northern Europe.
Now let's put some numbers on this. So guidelines are around 40 grams of fiber a day, and Americans eat 15 or 20 grams of fiber a day. Yeah. Justin and Erica Sonnenberg work with the Hadza, this indigenous tribe that eats about 100 or more grams of fiber a day. So you can eat a lot more fiber than that. So we got these people to go from 20 to 40 grams a day. They had about 4 weeks to ramp up and about 6 weeks to maintain that level. And then we took people and said, how much fermented food do you eat? They said, almost none. We said, well, you eat 6 servings a day. And they said, 6? Oh my God.
So Christopher, just what's a fermented food? Could you give some examples?
Yeah. Well, and we're going to save some time. There's a lot more details to go into, but half a cup of sauerkraut, half a cup of kimchi. The bottles of kombucha that you buy in a store actually are 2 servings. Yogurt, kefir works. I'm missing one other. So there's 5 or 6 foods that they could eat, say, and you don't have to eat any one all the time if you really don't like kimchi, but please try different varieties. Have some kimchi, have some sauerkraut, have some things. We actually got these 18 people to eat 6 servings a day. Now, the caloric value of those 6 servings a day was really only about 300 calories, because some of this is just a half a cup for a serving, pretty small. So it's really like 1/8 of their calories were their fermented food. But we had fiber and fermented food, and we saw that the fermented food changed the microbiome significantly. Fascinatingly, of all the different bacterial species that appeared, only 5% of them came from the foods that they were eating. This is what we still have to elaborate on where they came from, but it seems like changing the milieu, the matrix in the gut of microbiome, opened up the possibility that certain species that were probably there at a subdetectable level bloomed, and they were enjoying this new thing. The fiber folks, we actually didn't increase their microbial diversity, but we did see 3 separate sets of people. One group improved and lowered their inflammation. One didn't see much difference. And one actually had more inflammation in the fiber group. And looking at this, it's for a follow-up study, but it actually appears that the ones who had a worse response to high fiber and increased their inflammation had a very low microbial diversity. So it's like, hey, there wasn't much there to handle all this new fiber coming down the pipe. And it was a challenge. Oh my God, that's actually too much fiber for me. As opposed to the fermented group, no matter what they were eating, very consistently, inflammatory markers went down. About 19 different inflammatory markers dropped, no matter what they were eating. And we saw this consistent change. And so the Sonnenbergs had a very interesting sort of interpretation of this study as a whole, is that the US microbial diversity is lousy. It's been depleted over decades. And if you add this fermented food, you'll increase the microbial diversity. You will lower your inflammation. That's sort of a foundational thing. People, eat more of these fermented foods, of which many cultures have eaten for many years, but a lot of people don't. Now, from a fiber perspective, Fiber is probably good for you. Feed your friends, feed your microbiome. The Sonnenbergs actually call them MAX, microbiota accessible carbohydrates, because they don't eat up all the fiber that they get. So, and it's hard to specify which ones are which right now. So just think whole intact grains, fruits, beans, nuts.
All the same things basically that you were just talking about before in terms of being good for you.
Yep. And so, however, if your microbial diversity isn't high, you might want to have some fermented foods first to increase your microbial diversity. So their take on this was that everybody could benefit from more fermented foods as sort of a foundational diet. From the fiber side, it may be more personalized. It may depend on which microbes you have, which ones are missing, which types of fiber-rich foods that you eat. So there may be some room for personalization on this side. There's a foundational need to increase fermented foods on this side. But again, this is why Zoe's playing such an important role here, is trying to tease apart what some of this personalization is on top of a foundational diet, of which there really isn't that much confusion. There really isn't that much controversy if you look across the spectrum. Maybe the keto and the vegan folks are going to fight about a few things. But honestly, if you just take a step from vegan to vegetarian and from keto to low carb, there's pretty unanimous agreement on a lot of the foods that you should be eating. They're not
that makes sense.
They're not rapid weight loss. It's satiety, not trying to lose weight really fast, a sustainable diet. So if that's your New Year's resolution, eat this more whole food, plant-based diet, and don't get stuck up on vegan. Have some eggs, have some animal products, or not. You can do this as a vegetarian or vegan, but don't be stuck on those extremes, because the extremes is what undermines people. When they restrict this thing forever and they can't have it, and they find out they can't stick with it, sometimes just going back a little bit nudges them back to their whole previous diet. The whole thing is lost, and it could be worse. So you were talking about, is it worse to do it that way? Jonathan, I don't know if you've seen this, but I know you're aware of Kevin Hall's study about the Biggest Loser in the US, where the people who lost tons of weight and then 6 years later gained it all back had messed up metabolism.
Absolutely.
There's just something this week where they revisited it again. So I encourage you to go look. I just saw it in the paper the other day. I haven't talked to Kevin Hall, but he's actually gone back to those and looked even more about how messed up that metabolism is when you lose weight really fast. It comes back and to bite you later.
Again, just to make, that's back to this point about if you're thinking about calorie restriction, you're doing something that's really tight, you're doing something that's very unnatural for us, your body it basically goes into this sort of famine setting, right, Christopher? That's what I understand from that paper. And then that's just, it sort of just switches off your ability to lose weight. It sets a whole bunch of things that are bad, and sort of quite the opposite, I think, of what you're describing, right? Which is all of these foods you can add into your diet. And if I play back some of what you're saying, you've described a whole variety of whole grains, of whole foods. You've described fats like nuts as being really healthy. And then I think what, as you talked about the, this latest microbiome research, I think this was one of those ways to help to understand what might be going on, right? So as we go into human beings, that these microbes are somehow playing this very important role. We know that the fiber, this intact food, the opposite of this ultra processed food, is actually making through to the microbes are able to do stuff. But I think things like this fermented results is fascinating, right? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that people who are eating a lot of these fermented foods, this is good for them. But to be able to do this sort of in-depth study and actually see a change in people's body, what's happening with things like their inflammatory markers, is very exciting. And I think we should obviously say to all our listeners that this is a pretty small study in terms of number of people.
Yes.
And so I think one of the things always to look out for is like, how big is the study? And so I think, Christopher, you would say, right, you've got to be careful with a study of this scale versus something like Diet Fits, that you probably wouldn't weight as much sort of the individual conclusions, and it's a sort of stepping stone. Often this is the joy of science, right? You do these smaller scale studies, you understand, you get these hypotheses, and then you have the ability to do things at sort of really large scale, right? To start to understand, like, does this really stand out?
Which is why Zoe is perfect for large scale. So if you are getting thousands of people and getting their data, the insights that are possible from this are tantalizing. Yeah, I'm super excited about what lies ahead and what can be learned from the Zoe participants.
Well, that is definitely a great place to stop. And I look forward to having follow on. There's so many other topics that I'd love to discuss with you, Christopher, but I think we should stop here now and we can come back to some of the new things that we learn later in the year. This has been so much fun. I hope that it's been interesting for our listeners, hopefully convinced a few of them not to embark on, the crazy cauliflower soup diet for the rest of the month and think about something that is sustainable. I'm hoping that Christopher will be opening that vegetarian restaurant in Stanford later in the year, and I expect a window seat as soon as COVID allows me to travel again. Thank you so much, Christopher, for joining me on the Zoe Science podcast. I know I speak for people listening that was fascinating and fun. I really hope that everybody listening did enjoy today's episode. Please be sure to leave us a review and subscribe if you did. If you're interested in learning more about Zoe and the best foods for your body, you can head to joinzoe.com/podcast and get 10% off your personalized nutrition program. And we'll also put there some pointers to more of the research that Christopher's been talking about today. As always, I'm your host, Jonathan Wolf. The Zoe Science podcast is produced with support from Sharon Feder and Kirsten Cade here at Zoe. See you next time.